Hello friends and welcome to Zia IAS. Today we will be discussing about Ecotone, and in that we will discuss about the edge effect, edge species and ecological niche. So these are the topics that we will be discussing today. Before we look into the details of the topics that we will discuss today, let me tell you this is the third video or third lecture in this series in which we will be completing the entire syllabus for Ecology and Environment from your UPSC Civil Services Examination perspective, from your prelims as well as from your mains perspective. So today in this lecture we will be discussing about Ecotone. So under Ecotone we will discuss about what are the different characteristics of the Ecotone. We will discuss about the concept of ecocline. We will also discuss about edge effect. Then we will see what is an edge species and also ecological niche, and what is the difference between an ecological niche and a habitat. So a very important conceptual class, and ecological niche was a previous year UPSC preliminary examination question. A direct question was asked about ecological niche. So we will discuss all that in detail in this lecture. So let's move on to the lecture. First, coming to Ecotone. So let's see what is an Ecotone. So Ecotone, it is basically a zone of conjunction or a zone of junction, or we can call it as a transition area between two diverse ecosystems. So two diverse ecosystems, and there will be a transitional area. So when we move from one type of ecosystem to the other, there will be a boundary or what we call as a zone of junction. That is a junction where two diverse ecosystems meet. So when this two diverse ecosystem meet, there will not be immediate start of the another ecosystem. Suppose for example, let us take it as an ocean and a grassland. Suppose these are two types of ecosystems. So here what we see is that when this ocean ends and when the other ecosystem, that is a grassland, starts, it is not an immediate start of the other, but rather there is a zone of junction, or this junction is where these two diverse ecosystems meet, and this junction will be an area of transition. This area of transition means that this transition area will display or showcase the characters of both these ecosystems, both the characters of ocean ecosystem and grassland ecosystem. So this is called an ecotone. So ecotone is the area, or it's a zone of junction where two different ecosystems or two different biomes, we can say two biomes or two diverse ecosystems meet. And ecotone, it's a zone where two communities meet and integrate. So these two communities, they meet in this transition zone and they integrate with each other. So they meet and integrate with each other. Now let me tell you some examples of the ecotone. One is mangrove forest. Mangrove forest is a very good example of an ecotone. So it is an ecotone between a marine and a terrestrial ecosystem. So mangrove is seen where the land ecosystem ends and where the aquatic ecosystem starts. So the transition zone between the land and the aquatic ecosystem. So this transitional ecosystem is this mangrove forest is an example of such a transitional ecosystem. Now other example, a grassland is a transition zone between a forest and a desert. So if we have a forest and if we have a desert, it's not that the forest ends and then and there the desert ecosystem starts. There is a transition area, and this is a grassland. So grassland is a very good example of transition between forest and desert. Then we have a estuary. So estuary is a transition zone between a freshwater and a saltwater ecosystem. So estuary, it's a transition zone or a zone of junction between freshwater and saltwater. Then we also have riverbank or marshland, and this is a ecotone between a dry and a wet ecosystem. So these are certain examples. These are also very important. So these are certain examples of ecotone. I hope the concept of ecotone is now clear for you. Now okay, I will just picturize it and explain it to you. So here we can take the ecosystem 1. So it can be any ecosystem, like how we have discussed about the mangroves. So mangrove ecosystem 1, let us take for example, it is a terrestrial ecosystem. So terrestrial ecosystem, and ecosystem 2 we have a marine ecosystem. So in between this terrestrial and marine ecosystem we have the mangrove. So mangrove is an example of this ecotone. Now another ecosystem let us take, as we have discussed earlier, grassland. So grassland is another ecotone. So grassland is the ecotone between forest and desert. So the second ecosystem is desert. Now I hope you got it. So ecosystem 1 and ecosystem 2, and in between both these ecosystems we have the transitional zone, or what we call as ecotone. So this is the ecotone. I hope you have understood the concept of ecotone by now. Now let's further move on. Let us come to the characteristics of an ecotone. So what will be the characters of a particular ecotone? Now we know that ecotone is a transitional area between two diverse ecosystems. So transitional area between two diverse ecosystems. Now it is narrow. It can be narrow or it can be wide. So either it can be narrow or it can be wide. So it means that there is no clear definition whether a ecotone has to be narrow or a wider ecosystem. So ecotone can be either narrow. This transition zone can be very narrow. Sometimes it can be very wide. A very good example is the ecotone between a grassland and a forest. So a grassland and a forest, it can be narrow. Now wide is the ecotone between the forest and the desert. It can be wider. So it can be either wide or narrow depending on the type of two diverse ecosystems. And second one, it is also a zone of tension, which means that ecotone has conditions intermediate to the adjacent ecosystems. So because the ecotone has conditions which are intermediate. Intermediate means between, or we can say in the middle of. Suppose two ecosystems, like let us take the example of a terrestrial ecosystem and a marine ecosystem, and in between them we have the mangroves. So this mangroves, the characteristics of mangroves can be intermediate conditions of that of terrestrial and marine, which means it will not completely exhibit the characters of a terrestrial ecosystem, whereas it will not also exhibit the characters of a marine ecosystem. So the characters of the ecotone can be intermediate depending upon the two diverse ecosystems. So it will have mixed, or what we can say, the characters which is intermediate to the two type of other ecosystems, and therefore it is called a zone of tension. Third feature is that the number of species and the population density of some of the species in the ecotone is much greater than the entire community. So this means that in the ecotone, that is in the transitional zone, sometimes the number of species and the population density of some of the species can be greater than either community, which means let us again take the example of mangroves itself. So this means that the number of species in mangrove ecosystem or in mangroves, as well as the population density of some of the species in this mangrove ecotone, it can be sometimes more than the number of species or the population density in terrestrial or marine ecosystems. So this is another feature. And the fourth one is that a well developed ecotone contains some organisms which are entirely different from that of the adjoining communities. Now in mangroves also we will see that in mangrove forest, the trees or the vegetation in the mangrove forest, it is entirely different from that of the adjoining ecosystems or from the communities. So a well developed ecotone. So if there is a well developed transitional area or an ecotone, then some organisms in this transition area are entirely different from that of the adjoining communities. So these are some of the characters of the ecotone. Now let's see this. So here we will see that in the ecosystem, in the ecotone zone, there are some species which are entirely different from that of the adjoining ecosystems. So this is an example. Now let us come to the next concept, which is called the ecocline. So ecocline, it's a zone of gradual but continuous. This is important. So ecocline, it's a zone of gradual but continuous change from one ecosystem to another when there is no sharp boundary between the two in terms of species composition. So ecocline means that there is a gradual means slow, but even though it is slow, it is a continuous change. So it's a zone of gradual but continuous change from one ecosystem to another ecosystem when there is no sharp boundary between the two in terms of the species composition. So ecocline, it means that from one ecosystem, let us take for example forest and desert. So this is two different ecosystems. Now ecocline means from forest there is a decline to desert. Forest means there is an abundance of vegetation, whereas desert means there is an absence of vegetation. Now from the forest towards the desert, there is a gradual change in the ecosystem, but even though this is a slow change or a gradual change, it is a continuous change, and this happens when there is no sharp boundary. So in cases where there is no sharp boundary between, or boundary which divides this forest and the desert ecosystem, this is called a ecocline. So ecocline, two things has to be clear. One is that no sharp boundary or no specified boundary between the two ecosystems. Second one, from the first ecosystem to the second ecosystem, there is a slow but a continuous change. So this is called a ecocline. Now ecocline occurs across the gradual change in abiotic factors such as altitude, temperature, salinity, depth, etc. So ecocline, this gradual but continuous change, it occurs across the gradual change in abiotic factors. Abiotic means non-living factors. So this change occurs due to the gradual change in the non-living factors like altitude, that is the height, temperature, that is the warmth or the heat, then salinity and the depth. Depending on the abiotic factors, or rather we can say physical factors, this gradual change happens. So I hope this concept of ecocline is also clear for you. Now let's come to the edge effect. Now edge effect is also very important, and edge species are also very important. Now edge effect refers to the changes in the population. So it is the change in population or community structures that occur at the boundary of two habitats. So edge effect, edge means edge, the boundary. So edge itself means the boundary. So edge effect means that the changes that are happening to a population or a community at the boundary of two habitats. Now what is the boundary of two habitats? That is a ecotone. We have learned that ecotone is the boundary of two particular habitats or two particular ecosystems. So there will be some changes in the population or the community at the boundary or the ecotone, which is called the edge effect. Now let's see how it is. The number of species and the population density of some of the species in the ecotone is much greater than the either community. We have already discussed this as a characteristic of the ecotone. What did we say? In case of mangroves, from the terrestrial to the aquatic ecosystem or to the marine ecosystem, the transitional zone sometimes is the mangroves. Now in case of mangroves, we will see diverse species, or we will see some species which are not either found in terrestrial ecosystem or in aquatic or marine ecosystem. So why is this happening? This is as a result of the edge effect. Edge effect means the effect that is happening to the population or to the community at the boundary of two habitats. Now we also need to understand what is an edge species. So edge species refers to those organisms which occur primarily or most abundantly in this zone. So in this zone means ecotone. Ecotone is a transitional area, or we can say it is the boundary. So edge species are those organisms which primarily occur or most abundantly occur in the zone of transition or the ecotone. These species are called edge species. So whenever you hear the term edge, bring into the concept of boundary between two ecosystems, which is the ecotone. So edge effect means that between two ecosystems in which lies the transition zone. In this transition zone there can be some abundance of species, or sometimes there can be some rare species which are not either found in either of these ecosystems. So these species they occur primarily or most abundantly in this zone of transition, which is called the edge species. So I hope this is also clear for you. And then coming to edge effect. Edge effect is especially applicable to birds in the terrestrial ecosystems. Now what is edge effect? Edge effect is that the number of species and population density of some of the species in the ecotone is much higher than either community. So this is called edge effect. Now edge effect in terrestrial ecosystem is mostly applicable to birds. So in case of terrestrial ecosystem, let us take one example. For example, the density of birds is greater in ecotone than in forest and desert. So birds is a very good example, where in the ecotone we will see an abundance of bird species as compared to forest and desert. Forest and deserts are two types of terrestrial ecosystem, and in the transitional zone we will see more number of birds. Now let's come to a very important concept, which is the ecological niche. Why this is important is because this was a previous year question asked by the UPSC. I will also come to the question. So first let us see what is an ecological niche. So ecological niche, it refers to the unique functional role and position of a species in its habitat or in its ecosystem. So we also will learn what is the difference between a niche and a habitat. Then this will be more clear for you. But understand that the ecological niche, it means the unique. Unique means nobody else can do that function. It's unique to a particular species. So it is the unique functional role. So functional role of every species in an ecosystem is different. Every species in an ecosystem has different functions to play. So they have some unique functions or roles in a particular ecosystem or in a habitat. So this unique functional role played by each species in a particular habitat or in the particular ecosystem is called the ecological niche of a species. So understand that it is the unique functional role, and this has to be very clear. Do not forget it, or this term has to be very clear for you, that it is the unique functional role played by an organism or a species in a particular habitat or in an ecosystem. So this functional characteristics of a species in its habitat, it is referred as the niche in that common habitat. And in nature, many species occupy the same habitat, but they perform differently. So many species occupy the same habitat, but they have to perform different functions. Now you get a clue about the difference between habitat and the niche, because in a habitat, if you take, there are various species. So many number of species. So each species will have different roles to play. So habitat means the place where they live and occupy. Whereas niche means that it is the unique functional role of a particular species in that ecosystem. So to conserve species in its native habitat, we should have a knowledge about the niche requirements of the species. Why? Because every species has its own functional role, unique functional role. And to conservation of species, for conservation of species, we need to know the functional role. So we will be able to better conserve the species in its native habitat only if we have good knowledge about the niche requirements. So this is very important. So why is a knowledge about niche important? It is because to conserve the species in their native habitat, we should be able to understand what is the functional role of the species in that habitat. Now let's see an example. So here both share the same habitat and the same food source, but each has its own ecological niche due to different hunting behavior. So here we will see that both these species, they have the same habitat. They live in the same place, or their habitat is the same, and also they have the same source of food, but their niche is different. Niche is different because their functional role is different. So even though habitat is same, it is not necessary to have a same niche. Niche is unique to every species. Every species will have its own unique functional role, which is the niche. Now different types of niche. So first one is habitat niche. So it is where it lives, where the species lives, and we have the food niche, that is what the species eats. Next is a reproductive niche, which means how and when the species reproduces. Next is physical and chemical niche, which includes temperature, land slope, humidity and other requirements. So these are the different types of niche. Now niche plays a very important role in the conservation of organisms. As we said, if we are only able to understand the functional role, the unique functional role of an organism, then only we will be able to conserve it in the native habitat. Now let's see what is the difference between a niche and a habitat. So basically a habitat of a species is where it lives. So it is the address of the species or the home where the species lives, whereas the niche is the activities and the responses specific to the species. So we can remember it as your address is your habitat, whereas your profession is your niche. So profession is your functional role, whereas your address is where you live. So this is how you can remember the difference between niche and the habitat. So habitat is where it lives, and niche means the activities or the responses that the species carry out. And niche is unique for a species, while many species share the same habitat. So that is what I said. Many number of species can live in the same habitat. So 7, 8. So many species can live here. This is their habitat. Whereas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, 8, all of these species will have different roles to play, or unique functional roles, which is called the niche. And no two species in a habitat can have the same niche, since competition will lead to displacement of one species. So two species living in the same habitat will not have the same niche. They will not have the same functional role. If they have the same functional role, then one species will die because of the competition. An example is, different species of insects can be pests of the same plant, but can coexist only if they feed on different parts of the same plant. Suppose for example a plant. So there are many types of insects, but if this insects or the pest, they can coexist only different pest or different types of pest depend on different parts of the plant. Suppose if the leaf of the plant, this is the part where all the insects feed upon, then this will lead to competition and the fittest will survive. So this is a very good example. So niche and habitat, I hope now you got the difference. So this is all about niche and habitat. Now let's also discuss about the previous year question which was asked by UPSC. Now the question was, which of the following terms describes not only the physical space, so physical space, but also the functional role. So this was the question. So question was the proper definition, or which of the term describes the physical space plus the functional role of a organism in a community. Now we know that physical space refers to the habitat. So if the question was only to answer about the physical space, definitely the answer could have been habitat. But physical space, that is habitat plus the unique functional role, which is the niche. So answer was ecological niche, and many other options were given like ecotone, habitat, home range, etc. But if you knew that functional role of an organism means niche, then you could have made it right. So this was a previous year question. So from this we understand that UPSC also ask you questions based on your conceptual clarity. So it's very important to clear the concepts also. Many of you think that the current affairs is just enough to crack the ecology parts or the ecology questions of the UPSC preliminary exam, but that is not a right perspective. You should be very well aware about the concepts also. So with this we end this part of the lecture series. So I'll meet you again with the next part of the lecture series. So this is the third one. Next we will continue with the fourth lecture. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like the video if you found it beneficial to you, and also do share it with your friends. Thank you.